I think quite often engineers are so busy learning the technical and the engineering aspects themselves that they really don't have the opportunity to get a deeper understanding of how is this going to play in the broader societal sense? How is this driven by historical or political or legal factors?
Hey, Space Watchers, and welcome back to another episode of Space Café Radio. And this time we bring it to you live from Boulder in Colorado. And I have the great pleasure now to sit together with Professor Dan Baker from UC Boulder. Dan, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
Maybe for our listeners, you can introduce yourself and what you're doing, what fantastic work you're doing here at the university.
This is Dan Baker. I'm director of the Space Policy Center here at the University of Colorado. I'm also faculty member in the Department of Astrophysical and Planetary Sciences. I am affiliated with the physics department here at the University of Colorado and also the aerospace engineering department. And for many years, I was director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, where I still do research. So I've got a lot of different hats. My principal job as director of the Space Policy Center is to try to bring together issues related to science, engineering, business, and law as they affect space policy matters.
Let's focus in our conversation today about the Space Policy Center. Can you give us a bit of an historic background where the center comes from? Because if I understood, it's a quite new center, a quite new initiative. So if that is correct, so what is the motivation to start with that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I would say that my interest in space policy goes back a very long ways. But when I came to the University of Colorado, I started teaching a course in space policy. It was called Space Science, Policy and Practice. And I realized that there was a real hunger among students to know more where the space program came from, where it presently is, and where it might be headed. And it seemed to me that in addition to offering one class that was limited to 30 students, it might be very nice and very important to have a more broad kind of look at space policy and to bring together the engineering, the science, the business and law school components here at the university and to offer a greater opportunity for students to learn more about this, but also to try to inform policymakers more about what some of the issues are. Pre-COVID, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, it seemed to me that setting up such a center would really be valuable. Why Colorado? Because I would say that on a per capita basis, perhaps on an absolute basis, there's no place in the world that's as involved in space things in all dimensions as the Front Range of Colorado. Aerospace industry is very large here. Military space is very large here. Science is very large. Space science is very large here. And so this seemed like a very natural place to have this. We knew that there were space policy entities, many places in the world.
Yeah, let me counter that. Even in the US, you have space policy institutes or entities in Washington with GW, with Henry Hertzfeld, or Michelle Hanlon in Mississippi.
Scott Pace and all. And we were well aware of this, and we knew that space policy was addressed in many companies. It's addressed in many military and think tanks. But what other place in the world is so embedded within space research, scientific civil space, so embedded with national security and military space, that has such a large and dynamic space component? And then also has the academic interest in space policy issues as well. What we wanted to do was to not duplicate what others were doing. We wanted to find a unique niche, and our belief was that by starting more from the scientific and technical side, the engineering side, and to add policy, political science, and legal concerns and so forth to that would offer a unique kind of formula for achieving some of our goals.
Before we dive into what is different and what is specific here in your institute, why did it took then so long if all the ingredients you just mentioned are here in an unseen way?
Why did it take so long is an excellent question. And I was ready to initiate this 10 years ago. I had at least 3 full-time day jobs. And what really came to my mind was, if we're going to do this, we have to have a more dedicated, more purposeful kind of approach. So I decided that rather than seek another term as director of the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics, where there were at that time 750 people and a $200 million enterprise to do space stuff, why not step into the director role and really have a dedicated center? And so I worked with the provost, the chancellor, and the deans, and really said, if we're going to do this, we should do it right, and we should really start a new center. And so your question's a perfectly good one. We could have been doing things, and in some sense, we're doing things for a long time. But what we really needed to do was to get more focus and more purposeful in getting a center truly established. And so about a year ago, we really got this stood up and moved into these quarters and started adding students and professional senior advisors and a board. And I'm very excited that we finally traded this from being a back burner, a secondary or tertiary kind of activity, to being a more focused principal activity.
Wonderful. Then I think now it's time to go deep into, so what is the difference, or how do you approach space policy here, and which areas do you focus at the end of the day?
Focusing on, since there's such a vast number of issues that touch on space policy, the real question is indeed, what are the ones that really need the most attention? And how do we differentiate ourselves from other organizations that are doing space policy? And I allude to that, and I can sort of state that many space policy entities, whether they're in think tanks or they're in various agencies or so, really involve often political scientists and perhaps lawyers and maybe business people. But very few places are deeply involved in science and engineering of space, and then try to add the political science and the legal and business aspects to that. So we're coming at it perhaps from exactly the opposite direction that many other places would come at space policy. And the thing that we really want to do is to not reinvent the wheel, not to do things that others can do and are doing better. And we know that George Washington University is outstanding in its political science component for its policy institute, and it's very embedded within the political realm in D.C. Here, we're 2,000 miles away. The high frequencies of politics may damp out a little bit, and we can maybe take a more longer look at the key things involving civil space. And there are a huge number of companies, small, medium, and large space companies here in Colorado, and we're right in the midst of those. There's also a very strong military space here, and again, we're very close and engaged with those aspects. And I would say that we're also very cognizant that CU has very strong space activity in its academic setting. And we're really seeking to bring and offer opportunity for more students to really come here and learn about space policy in that kind of academic sense.
Help me to understand one thing. I'm an engineer by training, by myself. And for me, is it not obvious? Why do I need policy/space policy in our work? Maybe you can bridge that better, at least for my understanding.
Let me say that I think that engineers are wonderful technical folks. And I think that they love numbers, they love finding solutions to problems, and they love to make things work.
Sometimes we also love to find problems for the solutions, but that's a different thing.
Solutions looking for a problem. Yes, that's true too. But what I've found is that there are many engineers who are trying to understand more deeply, why are we doing things? What's the reason? And how is this going to be used in the broader societal sense? And I think quite often engineers are so busy learning the technical and the engineering aspects themselves that they really don't have the opportunity to get a deeper understanding of how is this going to play in the broader societal sense? How is this driven by historical or political or legal factors? And our belief was that by offering more of an opportunity to be an attractor to students who are interested in that, but who want to be more broadly aware of the full implications of the work they're involved in, and especially maybe offer an opportunity also for young professionals who are here, who've come to the area to work on science or engineering programs in companies, to offer an opportunity for them to understand, where did the space program come from? Why did it develop as it did? How is the space program changing now in the present time? How is it likely to change in the future? What are going to be the drivers for the space program going forward? And for a long time, I think we wished, almost prayed, that there would be a more commercial space component. And now we're getting our wish, and it's developing in what we might call a Wild West kind of environment. And don't we need people, responsible individuals who are great engineers, but who are also thinking more responsibly about how space is being used and how it might be used? And we want to try to add those dimensions to the education and training of engineers and scientists so that they can understand how to be socially responsible as well as technically.
How would you describe the gap between where space policy is today and where it should be, taking into account these huge up-ramp that space now got? And I see that from the communication point of view. We talked about space over the last 10, 15 years in my case, and now suddenly it's there. Everything we dreamed of is there, but not in a color where we want to see it or where we imagined. So now it comes with a very camouflage aspect, military dominated. So how far is the policy gap that you see?
I think in some respects it's quite vast. I think that the policy gaps, understanding how we're using, for example, low Earth orbit, which is becoming populated and many would argue overpopulated, and the risk that involves, there are possibilities of more and more debris, more and more damage can occur in space, including the Kessler syndrome, which may make whole regions of space unusable. The more dense use of space that makes launching of spacecraft a real challenge these days. I might just relate that I'm an investigator on the IMAP mission that was launched out to the L1, first Lagrangian point. And it used to be that to launch, you had many minutes or maybe even hours where you could launch without worrying about collision. Collision avoidance was not an issue. For IMAP, we had 20 seconds in order to launch safely to be sure of avoiding collision and with a spacecraft they're flying over. We see that nighttime astronomy is being severely impacted by glint from satellites in low Earth orbit. The leakage of electromagnetic signals from spacecraft, at least first-generation spacecraft, is having a significant effect on radio astronomy. And we really also have to think about what is space doing for indigenous people or just for the average person who wants to go out in the nighttime sky here, go to the Rocky Mountain National Park where the skies are very dark and just be able to see the sky without satellites crisscrossing. We think that those who are involved in engineering programs need to understand how to minimize the impacts on others. We need to talk to business people to understand that just pursuing business, the profit motive, without understanding the implications for the rest of society or for science, basic sciences and stuff, is really important. We need to think about, okay, we're having this experience now in low Earth orbit, but what may happen when mining the moon starts to be a realistic proposition, or that we start to send more human missions to Mars, and how do we make sure that we don't inescapably alter the Martian environment, or if we go to even further beyond. I think we need to have individuals involved in the space program in policymaking roles, but also just in doing the basic work to think responsibly about how to do these things without damaging the things that we go to explore.
Within the policy structure that you teach or that you're growing here, is data sovereignty, you mentioned indigenous people, so I asked, is data sovereignty or sovereignty over information and program IP, is that part of the structure of the program?
It is, and what we are trying to do is to think about all the different facets of space, including the data and how they're used and how available they are. And what I have to emphasize is that not any individual can know and be expert in all these things, but what we can do is take advantage of a very space-oriented university that has people who are interested in all aspects, and again, really try to engage with those folks and bring them into the fold and really let them apply their expertise. And our goal is to have a certificate program that has a strong science and engineering component, but also a business component and also a law component. And in the engineering component, of course, data and data utilization would be one important component of this. By offering students and young professionals the opportunity to get exposure to all the different dimensions I think it starts to raise their awareness and makes them go back to their jobs and rising through the ranks in business to be much more knowledgeable. And I guess not to forget, one of our principal objectives has also been to realize that space and space-related issues are very complex, and that what we're trying to do is to be a resource to present-day policymakers, for us senators and congressmen who are confronted all the time with questions about should I go this way, should I vote this way, or should I vote this way? We're not trying to see as much as we're trying to advise what the implications are for following one path or another. And by helping to distill these complex issues and be able to make it pretty accessible for even people who are not well trained in the science of space or the engineering space to really understand this is what would happen if we went this way. This might be what would happen if we went this way.
I was listening very carefully about the topics you just mentioned, especially when it came to LEO. And I'm asking, how academic is your work today? Because if you compare that with the real politics that we see, applying of commercial methods into space, or I would call it a turbo capitalism or even imperialism in space, taking into account the executive orders that were issued, especially last year about space, how does that match with what you try to achieve here?
It used to be that academic things, you could sit back and smoke a pipe and think deep thoughts, and it might be something that would affect things 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 50 years from now. Right now, decisions are being made and actions are being taken that require decisions on, if not hours, at least days and weeks. So how do you set up a system that is useful, that is giving advice and trying to deal with realities as are really coming down the road very fast at us, rather than thinking just in abstract and not very time-critical way? So I'm repeating your question back to me, but what I would say is that what we're finding now, I think, is that things are happening very quickly. And we have the choice of either ignoring them or trying to stop them or trying to reach some kind of an accord where all the interests, the many diverse interests of society are at the table. And I think that's the best we can do. We can't, as the U.S. saying is, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I think things have progressed too far for us to say that let's stop, let's not have any more launches into LEO. What we're finding is that the economic incentives are too great to more and more companies, more and more countries are going to get involved. What we need to do is find some ways to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior. And the third component of what I think our center can do is to be a safe place to convene in-depth conversations between people who are involved in the space business, people who are trying to make policy decisions related to space, academics who are thinking about all these different aspects, and to have a really thoughtful and civil kind of conversation about these things, and to try to make the best kind of compromise between all these different competing, tugging components of low Earth orbit right now. I was just at a meeting, it was called a meeting of experts. I don't know if that's the right term or not, but it was about, I would say, 20, 25 people convened by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and stuff for the U.S. And the specific issue was, what are the effects of all the satellites that are entering the atmosphere now? We got off on discussing launch effects. Launching huge spacecraft daily or hourly into space creates a huge impact on the atmosphere. Satellites, everyone was advising, well, make them disposable so they burn up when they get back in the atmosphere. We're adding a huge amount of aluminum. We're adding other exotic materials, some of them catalytic, that are changing the entire character of the upper atmosphere. We're performing experiments that no one knows what the consequences are going to be. And then you add that to, as we launch, one launch accident can put a whole bunch of more debris into space around Earth. I think estimates are it's like 1.2 billion pieces between 1 and 10 centimeters are in space now. These are very significant risks. And a collision between major bodies in space now would create an almost impenetrable barrier, so you can't get out and you can't get back in. And we need a place where people can talk about the problems that are being created, but also what are the mitigations. We need to find ways to get rid of this material, the debris in space, safely and not create bigger problems in doing so. And these are things that we would really like to bring people together to talk about.
But is science hurt, or do we have an don't look up scenario at the moment?
Scientists, I think, have felt that they didn't have a seat at the table, or if they did have a seat, they were told to keep quiet because they aren't getting with the program because this is such a profitable thing to do. And I think now, again, let me emphasize that as a practicing scientist, I really want to make sure that science has a seat at the table. And I also want to make sure that this is an international, not a national conversation.
That is my next question. Absolutely. You talked about the Center of Excellence for the local senators, representatives in the US. What is the international work you're doing?
An excellent question. And I would say that space knows no boundaries, no national boundaries, and it probably shouldn't. And that almost any issue that you touch on, no matter how local you might think this is a Front Range Colorado issue, it quickly spreads to being a national and an international issue. All these things, the purview of humankind, it's not, we have no, because one country took the lead in developing low Earth orbit communication satellites, we have no right to believe that this is just our playground to do what we want. And I think this is one of the most important things, is to introduce into everyone's mind sort of an ethos, an understanding of doing things in a responsible way. And doing things not just for a profit motive, but also thinking about what are the implications for basic science, what are the implications for indigenous people who really have a right to dark and quiet skies, is the catchphrase, I think, for the IAU now. But if we can start to build into students and also into the minds of policymakers that this is the way to think about this, not in selfish terms, but in altruistic terms, I think we will have accomplished something useful then.
Are you working with the Institute also on the international forums as we speak? Legal subcommittee of UN Copius is going on. I think know a bit about the collaboration that you have with COSPAR. So are there other?
Yeah, and I think that the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR, has been around since the beginning of the space age. And I think it is one of the organizations that has a lot of experience and a lot of gravitas, and I think can reach out to countries and nations and space agencies all around the world. I would say that I'm, in a sense, somewhat disappointed that the United Nations didn't get more on top of these issues earlier. That I've heard conversations from leaders within Copius and other places that this has gone too far to try to set rules of the road, or so that they are going to be portals for information, but that they no longer feel that they have the authority or the capability to control what's developing in space. I think we need to have in-depth conversations. If we're going to just allow anything goes, the Wild West that I talked about before, or are we going to assume that there will be self-regulation, that industry will just, everybody will get together and agree on rules of the road? Or are we going to try to have really some kind of political enforcement of rules and regulation? My friends in the aerospace industry feel that they're already over-regulated, but I think some things are regulated and some things are not regulated at all. And I think this is something we have to get a deeper understanding of. And I think, again, it starts with conversation, but things are happening so rapidly that we have to stop talking about things and start doing things that are going to be effective. And it worries me that we have all the different parties, all the different organizations like our own that claim that we're dealing with space policy. I think we need to get more of the capable organizations that think they're doing space policy together and really resolve some of these fundamental issues of, okay, what are some things that we can agree upon, and how can we figure out a way to make sure that these things become enforced and enforceable, and that we can slow down the train where it needs to be slowed down, and that we can find effective ways to deal with the most vexing and challenging issues. And people hold out hope for different things to be tried, but as they say, hope is not a strategy. I think what we need is a really effective, strategic approach, and a trust that we can really get the most relevant players together and really convince industry that's in their self-interest to have the dark and quiet skies, to be a safe place that we can have. Sorry for rambling on here, but what I would say is that there's very little space law now. And this is what's really impressed me, is that other than the Outer Space Treaty, there's almost no guiding principles. The Outer Space Treaty was really an arms control document. And isn't it time that we've done damage to the Earth's oceans and to the atmosphere and to the land? Isn't it time that we act in order to prevent a similar kind of degradation of space before it's too late?
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but there are so many areas that I would love to have a follow-on conversation, and I don't want to allude on the last words you just said, because it's fully in line with what my thinking is. One final question. We are recording this here on the 10th of April, few hours before Artemis 2 is coming back from their first human mission after 50 years around the moon. What is your view on that from a policy point of view on impact that it will have?
One of the issues in our Space Policy Center that I believe we're going to try to address is what is the right balance between human exploration and robotic exploration of space. And in the past, we've seen that sometimes human exploration has become so dominant that it's limited what has been possible for robotic exploration. Similarly, I'd say there have been long stretches where the only space program has really been robotic, and we've done magnificent things scientifically with robotic. So I think a policy matter that deserves considerable attention is how do we strike the right balance? How do we understand what is appropriate for robotic exploration? How do we understand what is absolutely crucial to have human involvement? How do we manage risk associated with human exploration? What is the role of government going to be into the future? What is going to become more of a private enterprise activity for human exploration as well? And rather than stumbling forward on these things, wouldn't it be better to have a thoughtful conversation under the aegis of a center like ours, multiple centers, to really examine deeply the questions you're asking of if we're going to go back to the moon with human presence, are we going to do that responsibly? Are we going to do it in a way that preserves the wonderful science that's in that deep freeze on the surface of the moon? My close colleague here in the Colorado Space Policy Center, Dr. Burns, has been advocating for a long time to have low-frequency radio observations on the far side of the moon in a radio-quiet region. But if we start putting a lot of satellites into orbit around the moon, or we start building, exploiting, and mining the far side of the moon for helium-3 or something, what is that going to do to destroy that last safe place for doing quiet radio astronomy? Every time you turn around, there's an issue that comes up that I think deserves not just talking about it, but also coming up with constructive suggestions on how to pursue these sometimes very strongly competing objectives. And human exploration is certainly a component of that. And my personal view is that human exploration is very exciting. As you can tell from Artemis 2, the world is engaged. I often say it's good to imagine astronauts with solar wind blowing in their hair or something like that, as humans can really relate to that. But I think in the modern world, too, that younger people draw very little distinction between having sensors somewhere and seeing what's going on and having human eyes there. I'm personally convinced that a human geologist would make immense progress in a foreign body just looking and seeing what's going on, and that we can't have robots trained to do everything. But we also have to think that we, as a society, I think, take human life very seriously, and protecting that life and making sure that there are no catastrophic losses of astronauts, cosmonauts, whatever they may be. We really have to recognize that safety and the immense effort that goes into making safe space systems is a very costly proposition. And there comes some point where we simply can't afford to pay that big price to send humans there, but robots can do the job. Sorry for the rambling answer to your question, but I just think it's at the heart of a lot of things we would want to do with our policy thinking is figure out what is the right balance between human and robotic.
Right.
And we haven't touched on national security versus...
Absolutely, yeah. As I mentioned before, so there are so many people, so many topics that I would like to also talk about, but we saved it for another time.
I'd love to have a further conversation with you. Thank you for your excellent questions. And by asking these questions, you help us think better about what our center could and should be. And that's what we're trying to do, again, is to not try to do everything, but try to do some things that where we have unique capabilities and we're uniquely positioned to make a constructive, impactful kind of contribution.
Tom Becker, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
With that, SpaceWatch out. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.